Today's talk is titled, Let's Talk About Sects, the modern fascination with cults, to be delivered by Dr. Stephen Lloyd Moffett. Stephen Lloyd Moffett is a professor of comparative religion at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. After studying economics and film studies at Claremont McKenna College, he studied and lived with monks around the world for a year. A short career as a management consultant led him to drive over the course of a year to Tierra del Fuego, returning to start his formal study of religion. After concurrently receiving an MA in religious studies from UCSB, with a thesis dedicated to the mysticism of Cesar Chavez and Masters of Theology from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological School, with a study of early church fathers, he returned to Greece on a Fulbright fellowship to research a book on religious revival in modern Greece. Ultimately, he received his PhD in religious studies from UCSB and has been teaching at Cal Poly since 2005, where he has won numerous teaching awards. He is a frequent speaker around the county, occasional columnist for the San Luis Obispo Tribune, and co-founder of the Lavra community, which has a farm, vineyard, and gathering space for cultural and educational events. His most recent books are dedicated to the spirituality of wine. When not talking about religion, he is designing and now building a new environmental-friendly house. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to bring you the esteemed Dr. Stephen Lloyd Moffett.
Thanks. It's so great to be back and to get to talk about interesting topics again. I have to say, I fly a reasonable amount, and when I tell people I study religious studies, the most common response is, my aunt was in such and such a cult in the 1970s. Do you know that one? It's astonishing how many aunts were in these communities in the 1970s. I'm not sure where the uncles were, but everybody seems to have an aunt in this model. But today, Americans seem more obsessed than ever with what the media likes to call cults. Cults are having a bit of a heyday. There's literally thousands of podcasts out there, documentaries, TV shows out there. Here's a list of the 32 best podcasts, as if anyone would have time to listen to 32 after watching the 50 best documentaries on cults. Well, what is a cult? Well, let me provide the popular definition, which is a cult are dangerous spiritual movements where members are brainwashed by charismatic leaders. The quintessential cult is Jonestown, where more than 900 followers of the People's Temple died in the largest mass suicide in history. But there's Heaven's Gate, the Manson family, and whatever group your aunt was involved in the 1970s. Where does this term cult come from? Well, cult in Latin just means to care for. So agriculture is care for the agri, the earth, in that way. And in the ancient period, cultus deorum meant care for the gods. This meant, did you sacrifice? Did you take care of the gods? There was no negative valence with the term cult, but rather it just showed that you appreciated the traditional deities. Even in later Christian period, the term didn't really have too much of a negative valence. You'd often hear it among academics as just a branch or a family. So Christianity had three main cults: Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestant thought. Sometimes there would be a negative sense to it, as sometimes you heard Protestant scholars call Catholicism a papist cult, or Jehovah's Witness or Christian Science as a heretical cult, which had a negative valence to it. But it really didn't receive widespread usage until the 1960s and 1970s. So let me try to explain why it arose in the way we tend to know it now in the 1960s and 70s. But to do that, we need to go back to the 1950s. There's a lot of problems in America in the 1950s, but there was a perception of stability and an instinct to conform. Pinnacle Christianity in America was 1957, where 92% of Americans considered themselves religious and belonging to either Christianity or Judaism. And when you imagine that period, the ideal was this lovely little family here all together, and this boy who is going to grow up to live out the Christian life he was so kindly given by his parents. So the context of cult, though, is how did this boy grow up to become that guy, or I might have actually. Okay, it's funny because that one's ahead of this one. How did that cute boy in the picture end up traveling off to India, joining a guru, and rejecting his faith? And parents wanted to explain how that boy grew up, that they raised so well in the 1950s, would reject the upright faith that they guilted him into accepting. Or rather, why would they leave a church for a foreign faith? Well, I mean, as we get the numbers up, I mean, for the parents who were really afraid of the 1960s, the rise of the hippies and the corresponding decline in Christianity was really deeply felt. As the most respected sociologist of his era, Peter Berger, said in 1968, by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found in small sects huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. And so it could not be that our children of the 1950s, now in the 1960s, were freely thinking people who rejected their true religion for another religion. Rather, we shouldn't call these Christianity replacements religions at all. They are something different. They are cults. And so the phenomenon began in the 1970s, where we see a bevy of new books dedicated to the study of cult phenomenon, new religious movements that are stealing our children away from traditional Christianity. And here is the important point. These new religious worldviews shouldn't be deemed worthy to be given the title religion. Well, that should be reserved for the great religions. They were something new, something threatening, something other. They were cults. And like so many religious forms across history, some of these new religious movements went astray and became deadly. I mean, think of the Inquisition or the Crusades for Catholics, or the Buddhists inventing suicide bombers in Sri Lanka, or the Hindu nationalists killing Muslims in India. A certain subsection of all religious groups fall into dangerous patterns. And the media covered all of them for these new movements, because the people who buy the media, mostly the parents of the kids exploring these new religious media movements, would buy the magazines and books because it had all the ingredients you needed to guarantee sales in America: sex, religion, and violence, right? So it became the media obsession at the time. So cults were now dangerous spiritual movements, but if we define a religious group that has experienced abuse, financial mismanagement, and occasional violence towards outsiders, well, that's a thumbnail sketch of almost every religious history there. It's nothing unique to these groups. But another important ingredient of the cult definition that arose during this time was a claim that cults were brainwashing their people. You see, even if our kids didn't become one of the Manson kids, and just started doing yoga or something, they could not freely and reasonably be interested in these new ideas. Rather, there must be some other explanation for why my perfectly raised altar boy is traveling in India looking for a guru. And the explanation that came to be found was brainwashing. Now, where does brainwashing come from? Well, the roots of brainwashing the term itself was coined during the Korean War to describe the mind control used on American POWs who defected to Korea and China. It quickly got applied to other contexts in the Cold War, most often China and Russia. Its most famous example is fictional in the 1962 movie The Manchurian Candidate, which dramatized the idea of a robotic assassin brainwashed into defending the Russians. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, brainwashing was an active part of research, but by the CIA, who saw it as something positive. How can we brainwash people into re-educating them towards our side? So how did this term get used for new religious movements? Well, one of the important aspects is thankful to our neighbor up the road, the Hearst family. If you recall, Patty Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's daughter, was kidnapped at 19 by the Sudanese Liberation Army and eventually became an accomplice in their mission. When she was arrested and charged with bank robbery, her wealthy parents hired the best lawyers in the country, including F. Lee Bailey, who would later get OJ off. Their defense was not to deny she committed the crimes. After all, she admitted to committing the crimes. But their defense was to say she was not responsible or culpable for those crimes because she was brainwashed by her captives. She did not embrace the ideas of the SLA by her own will, but they were forced upon her. The jury didn't buy it in 1976, but the creative defense took hold in popular culture. How can you explain why my well-raised child joined the Hare Krishnas? It must be because he was brainwashed. There's no way our boy would choose to reject his family tradition. And there was another part of this history that's important here. Psychologists realized that many of those families would pay substantial amount of money to deprogram their children and get them out of dangerous cults. So in the 1970s, you see the rise of the Cult Awareness Network, which claimed to be a nonprofit organization to help families recover their children. However, what we now know is it was a network where virtually every family who called and made contact with the organization was told that, yes, indeed, their kid was in a cult, whether it was Hare Krishnas, Jews for Jesus, or even the yoga studio. They told everyone who called that they were their kid was part of a cult. And then they would be referred to local psychologists who would pay money to the Cult Awareness Network for their referral, as well as pay money to the Cult Awareness Network for deprogramming training. Eventually, Scientology sued the organization and won all their assets, since the deprogramming they promised had little scientific support in court, and they were primarily just trying to make money off scared families. But the reality is it's very hard to distinguish where brainwashing begins and where just religious formation or even education comes in. I mean, if you send your kids off to a Bible camp when they're 14 and tell them they're going to spend eternity in hell unless they accept Jesus, isn't that a bit of coercion? I mean, up until the 1960s, guilt and coercion were officially encouraged in the Catholic Church. After all, heaven was worth it. How many Chinese or Indian families shape their kids' worldview by reminding them that they'll bring shame to the family unless they X, Y, and Z? Informing a child that they're going to be reborn in a rodent unless they honor their families is a form of coercion. And Jewish mothers are legendary for their mind games they use to get their kids to agree with them. So what's the difference between religious education and traditional religions compared to new religious traditions? Or, I mean, let's be honest, I don't force students to accept what I say, but I do make them sit in a chair for 40 hours, write down everything I say, and tell them if they want an A and any chance of getting a job in the future, they better internalize what I tell them. Brainwashing? Education always involves shaping people's ideals. So the origins of cults has more to do with the social context it arises than anything objective. Here's the reality. Nobody joins a cult. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to join a movement that will mess with my mind, bring harm to the world, and inspire horror movies later on in life. Rather, all the time, people join spiritual and self-help movements that they think are good and will improve the lives of the world around them. Sometimes, like any assembly of movement, some subsection of them will go bad. These are the ones that make the media. But the reality is there's no definition of the word cult. Cult is just a derogatory term that people use for religions they don't like. That's it. Cult is a verbal weapon, a shorthand smear that connotes all sorts of negative traits without having to be anything specific. In religious studies, we have a saying like, what's the difference between a religion and a cult? 100 years and 100,000 followers. That is, if a new religious movement withstands time or spreads, it's no longer considered a cult. I've developed another theory here. If your religion can support a major party presidential nominee, you're no longer a cult. I remember when I was growing up, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also called the Mormons, now wanted to be known as LDS, wanted to build a church on my island that I grew up. Christian communities around the island mobilized against this cult coming to town. Well, fast forward 20 years and Mitt Romney can run for president. Yes, there was pushback, as we see here, but the very idea that Mitt Romney could be president means LDS is no longer seen widely as a cult. Nothing changed in LDS. It's just it got bigger and more accepted. You see, anything can be branded as a cult since it's not an objective designation, but rather a subjective attempt to slander something. Cult is ultimately just a term meant to stigmatize and delegitimate forms of religious expressions that you don't like. Anything can be it. So can I insert a joke here? Did you hear about the cult dedicated to the number 0? Well, it's ridiculous. Is nothing sacred? But really, the term cult is like fake news for Trump. When fake news might have meant something one day, but when fake news is just everything you don't like, it's no longer meaningful. Well, cult has lost its utility as a term. Let me give an example. The Christian Broadcasting Network in January of this year ran a story just 3 months ago, ran a story to help its 360 million people across 138 countries identify cults. Their definition was any group that does not recognize Jesus Christ as a unique Son of God. So every other religion is a cult. Later on, it lists the cults, including LDS, Mormons, Unity, and the Unitarians. So welcome to our cult meeting, my friends. So the term cult is primarily a weapon to slander groups we don't like. Well, then what should we call these groups? Well, the term I like is alternative religious movement. Alternative, because these are movements that are alternative to the norms of the day. An alternative religious movement is just one who has a counter perspective to what is typical in society. Some people call these countercultural religious movements or unconventional religious movements or marginal religious movements. The point is the same. I think what makes them different is that they are different. They're different from what's come in the past. Now, the vast majority of these movements are noble attempts to improve people's lives and help the world. Some of them get abusive and destructive, and these are the ones that tend to make news. A bunch of people gathering in a hall in Cambria to support each other and make a difference in the world is not news. Masked ritual orgies that involve tattoos and mushrooms might. Not suggesting it, but if you want to make news. But I think we should just call them abusive or destructive alternative religious movements. Cult is just another 4-letter word that we should banish from our common lexicon. But I also think we need to re-examine our perception of even the abusive religious movements. Well, when do they arise? Well, historians point out that alternative religious movements tend to arise during moments of social transition, of upheaval, unrest, instability. So we saw a lot in the 1960s, but it's also the economic upheaval of the 1840s, the technological revolutions of the 1880s, 1890s. When the perception is that everything is going well, people aren't looking to rock the boat and explore new avenues of living. But when we feel that things are uncertain, that we need to find something new to ground us, well, people want to make sense of the world only when the customary frameworks aren't serving them. That's why the tumult of the 1960s spewed a slew of alternative religions, right? This is the time when new things were possible, or as one social commentator said, at times of social evil, all things are possible. Well, who joins these religious movements? The typical story is that there are simple sheeple who too easily fall under the spell of dangerous men. Well, underlying this perception is a bit of victim blaming. There's something wrong with them. They were simpletons who got easily manipulated. Surely they should have anticipated what was going to happen. That could never happen to thoughtful religious people. And there's a bit of judgment placed on the people caught up in these movements. There's a subtle or sometimes not so subtle suggestion that surely I wouldn't have fallen for this. But studies show that it's often the most privileged members of society that tend to get involved with alternative religious movements. There was once a theory that it was the poor and uneducated who joined them. After all, they're looking for ways to have a place in society. But research has shown it's not the case. And I think it makes sense. The point is, if you have to have leisure time to explore new ways of seeing the world, if you're working 60 hours a week for minimum wage, it's unlikely you're going to have the mental space to engage in holistic change. So let's look at some examples. We've studied in class the Source family, a movement out of LA in the early 1970s with Father Lloyd. And one of the people in a very good documentary called The Source Family, Magus the Aquarian, he seems just like a normal guy, but as I've gotten to know him since the documentary, they leave out, he's from one of the wealthiest families in LA. He went to Harvard, and after he left the movement, he made a ton of money in tech. I mean, he was from a very privileged thing. The Om Shinrikyo, this is a group out of Japan who is most famous for letting off sarin gas in the Japanese subways. The two people who were eventually convicted of letting that gas off were both PhDs, one in economics and one in physics. Rajneesh Puram, this is the Osho or Rajneesh group in Oregon. So many of the people had masters and PhDs in the process. And Nexium, one of the more recent examples, the leadership are all famous actors that had a lot of money and a lot of time to develop it. So, these folks tend to be privileged. We also sometimes think that they must hate the world, like they, are lashing out after it. But those who get involved in alternative religious movements, even those that are destructive, tend to have very tender hearts and open minds. They're frustrated with the status quo. They think the world could be better. It can be more fair, more just. They really think the world can be better. And the people who are attracted to these movements tend to be more compassionate towards others than are not, because they think the world's messed up, but their response is not, I should just take care of myself. The idea is, I should take care of others. We can transform the world. The world can be better. And they're seekers after something new. Obviously, the status quo isn't working for them. So why do we think the world could be fixed by working through the status quo? There must be something out there. There must be something that has capacity to heal, to make it better. Don't tell me it's not possible, because just look at Jesus. He had 12 followers at the beginning, and they left their comfortable existence and dropped everything to follow him because they thought he had a message that could transform the world. They were rejected by their peers, yet they held on to the vision, even dying for the vision. And look at today. Well, they've been proved right? Literally billions of people are on board with that message. So few call Jesus a cult today, and the movement may have caused harm and exploitation, downright abuse at times, but it's done so much good in the world too. So if Christianity can begin with 12 guys following one guy, is it crazy to ask, why not us? Why not us? Why is it impossible that you think we might change the world? we can be the next success story. And yes, people might call us a cult and persecute us, but Jesus was called worse, and Jesus promised persecution because they're standing for truth, love, and compassion. So when your family sends a cult deprogrammer to extract you from this movement, tell them, I'm fine where I am. I'm changing the world. But the hope here is that each one thinks that the world can be made so much better. Is that working there? Oh, it's trying. Okay. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. World peace will come from my disciples meditating alone. Oh, I can promise world peace. Oroville in southern India. The creation of a new world, a new humanity, a new society expressing, embodying the new consciousness. Or will be a place of unending education, constant progress, and youth that never ages. Rajneesh. To create the largest, most free spiritual community in the history of the world based on meritocracy, the advancement of science, sexual liberation, environmentalism, and universal love. Even Scientology, the group most considered a cult in America today, says, what is our purpose? Scientology is the science of knowing how to know answers. Man is basically good, and his spiritual salvation depends upon himself, his relationship with his followers, and the attainment of brotherhood with the universe. The ultimate goal of Scientology is true spiritual enlightenment and freedom for all. And so here's what's so fascinating. People are buying into a vision to transform the world. And so those sort of dreamers are who joins these movements. Now, you can say that, how do they end up poisoning or murdering people? How do you get to that? I would never do that. Well, I run a little experiment with my students the past few years. It stemmed from about a handful of years ago. I came home and I was teaching the 1960s gurus. And I went to Amy, my partner, and said, hey, no one would buy these gurus today. Students aren't interested in it. The guru movement is dead. And her response was, people still will. It's just going to be different. It's going to have a different message, a different messenger. And as with most things in life, I can now publicly proclaim that she was right, and I am wrong as normal. And so I started to imagine, what new religious movement can I get my students to buy into? And so I developed a religion based on the spirituality of fighting climate change, an issue that many of my students feel passionate about. And I, in class, pitched them this new earth spiritual religion that would meet their sort of spiritual needs and their passion for protecting the planet. But the part that's interesting to our discussion today is I began to ask them, what stands in the way of this movement spreading? And it's not hard till somebody soon comes up with climate change denial. And I said, exactly. The climate change denial industry is what stands in your way. People are spending billions of dollars to try to encourage people not to embrace climate change. And here's where I fib a bit, but just a bit. I say there are 4 older white men who are financing the climate change denial industry. I call them the 4 horsemen of the coming environmental apocalypse. Then I open it up for discussion of what to do with these 4 older white men standing in the way of our good movement. Within 5 minutes, every single time, the same pattern emerges. A student suggests, sort of jokingly, that we should just kill them. Then a philosopher, usually somebody straight out of their previous class on utilitarianism, says, well, sacrificing 4 lives to save millions of lives is actually philosophically justified. And then after some debate, we take a vote. Should we secretly and compassionately eliminate the 4 horsemen of the environmental apocalypse? And then I've done this a dozen times. Every single time, at least 2/3 of the students vote to kill them. Wow. And then I reveal, this has all been an experiment of how long it took me to get a group to justify murder in the name of religion. If in 20 minutes I can get a group of college students to justify murder, Don't you think if you're a part of a movement that truly believed that you were transforming the world and dedicated a decade of your life or more to it, that you could get there? The point is that no one joins a movement thinking they're going to commit a crime, ever. Rather, they join movements that promotes a way of thinking of the world that they think will make it better. In the scope of their vision, it's the scope of their vision, the strength of their beliefs that allow it to go wrong. So just as Judaism promises to heal the world, Buddhism promises to end suffering, Islam promises to bring peace to all, so our movement can create a better future. So here's the point. People join alternative religious movements and self-help groups because they're dreamers that hope that the world will be transformed. Nobody joins a cult thinking it's going to be bad. So what happens? Well, the problem is the new religious movements only make news when they go wrong. So first we learn about these movements is in their final and often violent iteration. The media has no incentive to give a balanced perspective because the more they can tie a group to sex, abuse, and crimes, the more people click on their story. And I think we show compassion on those involved when we remind ourselves of the goodness that started the movement, right? At least that's what one of my friends, Rebecca Moore, who's on the left here, says. She is a professor at San Diego State University. Two of her sisters and her brother-in-law and her nephew all perished at Jonestown. And her sisters were willing accomplices to this tragedy. They were some of the people who forced others to drink the Kool-Aid, even if the vast majority of the 900 who died did so voluntarily. Now, the media reported that people like her sisters were either brainwashed victims or murderous co-conspirators. But Rebecca likes to point out her sisters were neither. They were good people. They had degrees. They were happy with their life's choices. They were supreme optimists who thought that they were part of the greatest movement that ever lived. Now, Rebecca acknowledges that her sisters made horrible choices in that final day, but she wants to remind everybody that their lives shouldn't be defined by that last choice. They were neither brainwashed victims nor murderous co-conspirator. They were idealists who hoped to fix the world, and we need to recover that. So I want to end by quickly retelling the story of Jonestown through the perspective of Rebecca's sister, Annie. So if you don't know much about Jonestown, Jim Jones grew up in the Midwest to a Christian family. His father often beat his mother on Saturday night, would promote racist ideas throughout the week, and yet sit on a pew on Sunday telling everybody he was a Christian. Jones was going to give up on Christianity, but then he began to read the Bible, and he realized that Christianity should promote racial equity and gender equity. He started a new church in Indianapolis called the People's Temple when he was 19, and it would be dedicated to racial equity and gender equity. Jones married a partner in the ministry, and they had not only their own kids, but they adopted a Black child and an Asian child to create a rainbow family that they argued should be the future of America and Christianity. As it turns out, Indianapolis did not agree with his form of Christianity, especially the idea that Christianity shouldn't promote segregation and women's rights. So they drove Jones out of town with actual violence and threats of more violence. Now, Rebecca's sister Annie was a toddler during this time. She didn't know about it because Jones was one of the first to really advocate for civil and women's rights in the late 1950s. Jones decided that if Indianapolis wasn't ready for it, California would be. He moved his family out to California to continue his radical vision of equality. You may not know this, but Sunday morning is the most racially segregated hour in America still to this day. Faith communities tend to be still segregated. Jones created the most racially diverse congregation in the history of America. Yet Jones added another element to his message in California, economic equality. The disparity between the haves and the have-not seemed profoundly unbiblical to Jones. So he began to advocate for a form of socialism long before it became popular with today's youth. This was the message of the Bible, he said. This is the message of the Buddha and Krishna. And this is the message that we read earlier today from our anonymous spiritual thinker. What we read was one of his sermons advocating for self-sacrificial love towards other and redistribution of wealth. And many of us here nodded our heads at that because for someone like Annie, this was a message that she thought people needed to hear in America, that we could live in a world of racial equality, gender equality, and economic justice. She wrote her parents in 1973 when she first went to the People's Temple, said, "I want to be part of changing the world to be a better place. And yes, I would give my life for the world to be better." That's that self-sacrificial love for the world to be better. A world grounded in racial, gender, and economic equality sounds like a vision that many would embrace today, including most of the people in the room. And you can appreciate why that would be appealing to people. And society noticed. President Jimmy Carter's wife visited the People's Temple. LA Times awarded Jim Jones Humanitarian of the Year. As the San Francisco Chronicle, he won the Martin Luther King Award. The legendary Harvey Milk wrote in the same year that the suicides would occur. Reverend Jim Jones is the man of highest character who has undertaken constructive remedies for social problems. He was an influential social thinker. But Jones' social and spiritual revolution meant that white capitalists would lose their privilege. So they fought back by writing scathing editorials, trying to bankrupt him through lawsuits. And of course they would. He was arguing for a different kind of Christianity where they would lose their privilege and power. And just as the opponents in Indianapolis drove him out of town, so eventually these lawsuits and these editorials drove him out of California. Annie Moore wrote her parents to tell them that California, in the end, isn't ready for us. So we're going to start over. We're going to move to Guyana in South America, one of the most remote places in the world. And her sister, brother-in-law, and nephew would be a part of this experiment to restart society. They were going to create a world that, for the next generation, that would be not grounded on the entrenched racism, misogyny, and economic exploitation of America. And they were going to build a utopia for the next generation that would be different. And so they started building. And it didn't always go smoothly. Reimagining all elements of society often is full of problems. They struggled a lot, and Annie would write to her parents talking about these struggles, like should they have money or should they just trade? Should traditional families persist? Annie's job was in the schools. She was trying to imagine an educational system that wouldn't be based on exploitation, but on equality. And the Moore families supported their daughter, but many families did not. They said the People's Temple was a cult, that their children were brainwashed and being held against their will. An enterprising young congressman, Leo Ryan, flies down to this remote hamlet to investigate. Of the nearly 1,000 people there, he found some people who did feel isolated and pressured to stay, and 4 of them volunteered to leave with him that day. But as they left, another group in the camp said, "This isn't going well. We are in the most remote place, and the US government found us. We can't let them leave." And so someone in the camp, and we're still not sure this day who it was, someone shot the congressman as he was getting on the plane. What happens? Panic sets in. And we have this all recorded because they recorded everything. And their movement just killed a congressman. So if there was any doubts that the US military was going to come and find them in the most remote corner of the world, well, those were gone. And we can hear this debate that happens. Some people say, let's go to Russia. US military would never attack us in Russia. Jim Jones is like, they'll never take us. Another person says, let's go to the moon and start a colony there. That's one place the US military can't come. And other people are like, that's not practical. Finally, Jim Jones reveals the last option, something that he'd been contemplating for a while. He said, what if they make a final dramatic protest against inequality? What if they announce to the world that they'd rather die than live in an unjust world where white capitalists will use their power to the ends of the earth to preserve their power and privilege? What if there was what if the whole world would hear that statement? And what if that whole world is so inspired by that act of defiance that they would rise up against the white capitalists and demand equality for all? What if that happened? Then nearly 900 people drank cyanide laced with a version of Kool-Aid, and what they thought was a dramatic statement of protest. Yes, there are some that seemed to be forced to drink it, and of course their children had no choice. Their parents gave it to them. But as this is happening, Annie wrote her parents on the very day. And we have this letter now. It says, "It seems that everything good that happens in the world is under constant attack. Our hatred of racism, of sexism, elitism, and mainly classism is what prompted us to make a new world for the people, a paradise in the jungle. The children loved it, and so did everyone else. What a beautiful place this is. The children were the freest, most intelligent children I'd ever known. We died because you would not let us live in peace." Rebecca's sister, Annie, was the second to last person left alive at Jonestown. She was writing this letter when people slowly slipped away. Probably worried that the US military was going to come before the poison would take hold, she and Jim Jones were the last two, and they shot themselves, eliminating their lives. Now, as we all know now, the dramatic gesture to protest inequality was not the message that spread around the world. It did not inspire people to rise up against the white capitalists controlling it. Instead, it got branded a murderous cult who allowed a charismatic leader, Jim Jones, to brainwash hundreds of people, leading to their death. But that's not the story that Rebecca wants to tell about her sister. The last horrific day doesn't define the idealism and hope that she had throughout her whole life. She didn't join a cult. She joined an alternative religious movement that was trying to fix the world, and it went horribly wrong. So here's where we end the story of cults. When we present cults as dangerous spiritual movements that brainwash their followers, we're dishonoring the dreamers who aspired and are still aspiring to create a just, more compassionate, more inclusive world. This instinct is a beautiful and honorific one, even if it goes off the rails sometimes in horrific ways. But I hope that we can recover the spirit when we look at others and when we look at ourselves. It may not sell a lot of magazines or inspire a lot of podcasts, but a society filled with such hopeful people may be just what we need, perhaps now more than ever. Thanks.